Hi, welcome to Mainline Mufon. My name is Jenn Stein, and I run programs at the Traditional Library on a monthly basis where I bring in speakers, they present there, and then they also come here to Radnor Studio to do an interview with us. So I'm very delighted to have a very special guest here today. His name is Laird Scranton, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about Laird. He graduated from Vassar College, and he is an independent software designer who became deeply interested in the Dogon tribe and their symbolism in the early 90s. So he's been studying ancient myth, language, and cosmology since about 1997, and he lectures at many universities and colleges, and he's written over 8 books on the topic. He's also featured in a lot of television programs you may have come across, specifically one with the late John Anthony West. There's a Magical Egypt DVD series, which Laird is featured in. Also, Carmen Boutlier's documentary on the Pyramid Code. He is a frequent presenter in conferences on ancient knowledge, like Walter Crittenden's conference known as CPEC, and the ARE's Ancient Mystery Conferences. I've had the pleasure of speaking at a couple of conferences with Laird, and I'm really, really delighted to have the opportunity to discuss what you presented last night at the Radnor Library, or the Tradifferent Library. Your most recent book is on Skara Brae, this ancient culture in the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. So I'd like to begin with you introducing us to why you took on this project and what you were actually looking for, and tell us, a little bit about Skara Brae for the listening and viewing audience that know nothing about it.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure.
Well, Skara Brae was a Neolithic farming village in Scotland. It dates to about 3200 BC, and there are not very well-developed theories among researchers as to who the people were who were there, what they were doing there beyond farming, and why in their spare time they devoted themselves to building megalithic sites. There's a series of stone sites that are placed around the island. This is an island just north of Scotland. My interest in the site actually came about because of an emailed question from a fan. I had never known much about it, and this fan wanted to know whether I thought it was possible there had been ancient Egyptian influences at Skara Brae. The researchers there can't make positive links to Scandinavia or to any of the nearby European communities that might have possibly populated it, so they can't connect pottery, they can't connect architecture. There are only a few artifacts that they've discovered. Skara Brae itself is a series of stone chambers. This is drywall stone construction with no mortar that are sort of set, surrounded by midden as insulation around these dwelling spaces that were really, really very nice places. An average college student would be very pleased to find one of these chambers to live in. So I began researching that from the perspective of whether there might have been Egyptian influences.
That's fascinating because, we think of these as diverse time periods and diverse locations, and people don't necessarily think the Egyptians were mariners.
No, and 3200 BC is awfully early for Egypt to have mounted an expedition to Scotland. The distance is pretty great, and dynastic Egypt didn't appear until a few hundred years after that. So I was skeptical from the beginning that we were going to find anything, any commonalities between the two. But I know that the Dogon tribe from Africa that I study looks to have been Egyptian at around 3000 BC, and they've done a very good job of preserving cultural traditions, and they have a societal ethic that prioritizes retaining original forms. So I thought maybe if there had been a connection, I might see some commonality there, but with the Dogon. In fact, one of the lifelong researchers on Orkney itself, an archaeologist, came away with the opinion that he saw commonalities between Neolithic Orkney and modern Africa, even more so than Scandinavia. So it wasn't out of the question.
Now, many of our viewers may not know anything about the Dogon tribe in Africa, and this is a fascinating topic. You have written 3 books on, I believe, if not 4, specifically on this unique group. So let's backtrack and give people a little introduction to the Dogon.
Okay, well, the Dogon make a very good entry point for comparative studies. My field of study is called comparative cosmology, and what that means is that I try to learn more about ancient myths and symbols and rituals by comparing how different cultures understood the same elements. So the Dogon make a very good entry point because their culture encompasses traditions of 3 ancient religions, basically. They have civic practices like ancient Egypt. They have rituals like ancient Judaism, and they have a symbolic cosmology that's a lot like ancient Buddhism, given in words that are very similar to ancient Egyptian words. So it's an excellent starting point to try to do comparative studies because you can find links in these various directions to important traditions. The Dogon are a priestly tribe. They live in a very isolated situation in Mali, in the northwest hump of Africa. They're situated in the desert, an 8-hour drive from Timbuktu.
Literally.
So really a very good place if you're trying to preserve an original tradition to be clear of modern influences.
Right, because they have not had a lot of interaction with the modern world.
Yeah,
so their traditions have been preserved.
Yeah, comparatively, not compared to other traditions. They are pristine. Their language is pristine. Actually, their language is very interesting. It's technically unclassifiable because it preserves up to 17 subgroups of languages from of words from other languages, and so you have an intermix of Tamil words and ancient Egyptian words, words that came out of a number of other cultures that all had bearing on the field of study.
Now, does that imply that possibly their language was a much, much earlier language, and parts of their language became or got interpreted into many other cultures? I mean, how does an artifact like that, the language, I'm referring to it as an artifact, but it is an artifact of culture. How does that happen?
Well, there are two effects that I see. The first one is that the cosmology itself looks like it's very ancient. It begins around 10,000 BC in the region of the Fertile Crescent, and it was originally an oral tradition. So the words are based on root syllables or root phonemes that you can see carried forward in one form or another in other cultures. But you can almost trace a lineage for the Dogon based on the language, the subgroup of words from various languages that they preserve. You can almost trace through a timeline of how they must have progressed regionally to get to where they are by looking at those subgroups.
It's absolutely fascinating. One of the topics you mentioned, and just briefly in your talk, but you touched on, is of course the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe at the top of this Fertile Crescent region area, right between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And Göbekli Tepe is an ancient site with standing stone pillars that was deliberately buried, and we now know from Klaus Schmidt's work that it dates back to 10,000 BC,
yeah, roughly
or
between 9
earlier.
and 10,000, right?
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the potential overlap that you see maybe with Skara Brae and Göbekli Tepe.
Well, the Dogon say that their symbolic cosmology was part of a deliberately instructed plan that was tagged to a civilizing plan whose purpose was to teach us agriculture. They say that the symbolic cosmology represents how their tribal god created matter. And in fact, the descriptions and the drawings that they provide are very scientific. You could set them side by side with descriptions and drawings from Stephen Hawking or Brian Greene and practically exchange paragraphs and not change the meaning of what one or the other is saying. You can also, in many cases, exchange diagrams. You understand immediately what the Dogon are trying to draw. And so there's that piece of it. The other piece is the preservation of agricultural practices that you see around the world. Some of the Dogon practices are also ancient Chinese practices. The plan that the Dogon implement for agriculture is a plan that was thought to be a theoretical plan in China. A lot of commonalities, different directions. My books have sort of made a geographic progression from Northwest Africa to Egypt to India, then Tibet and China, then on to Turkey, then made a jump to northern Scotland, which I really didn't expect to be moving to. The most recent book is about New Zealand, a group called the Maori in New Zealand. And all of these groups connect with each other. You can see the linkage through language and through ritual practices and through myths they have, words, the way they express things, all very similar.
I was also fascinated by one of the slides in your presentation where you were discussing the names for different regions of the world, and you were referring to north, east, south, and west, or top, bottom, and east and west, and those were identifying areas to the globe. And these are still names that refer to their regions today. So let's just review for us that I think it was the word for water.
Yes.
Or
well, the Dogon perspective is that this civilizing plan and symbolic cosmology was instructed to them in a remote site in ancient times. Now, what we see on Orkney Island are a series of megalithic stone sites that represent a sequence of shapes that I recognize as being stages of the formation of matter, according to what the Dogon describe. It's almost as if you laid out an alphabet in English on the ground in stone. You would realize this is a progression that means something. Well, the Dogon, so on Orkney, it looks as if someone was instructing cosmology on a human scale, a scale that you could actually walk through. Just before dynastic Egypt. And about 100 years later, okay, it also looks as if they were teaching agriculture at the time. About 100 years later, you see, against a backdrop of no particular history, 4 different regions of the world, agriculturally based kingships emerge, all at the same moment at about 3100 BC. One in Egypt called Taru, one in China called Iru, one in Ireland called Aru, and one in South America called Peru. And those terms, if you examine them in terms of Dogon and Egyptian language, from one perspective, refer to the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, which is roughly where those localities are situated. They also represent 4 progressive stages of agriculture, talking about an uncultivated field, a planted field, a field with crops growing in it, and a granary that where the harvested crops are stored.
Wow. I think I missed that final detail when I was hearing your presentation last night. So it's absolutely fascinating that there is, if you're looking in a broad perspective, which is one of the things I really appreciate, the way you approach your research. It's really more from a holistic base. You look for commonalities that can be drawn together rather than discarding facts or information because they don't fit with a preconceived idea that many archaeologists have. I think moving forward as we try to go back further in the understanding of human evolution on this planet, we have to begin to think in a perspective where we bring together like concepts, and that's really a fundamental basis of your work. I'm so impressed with it.
Well, the process is finding different ways to triangulate in on what must have been the original meaning of one of these elements. What did they really mean when they were talking about concepts of deity, or what were they really meaning when they talk about concepts of ascension, things like that. The biggest risk to my field of study, to someone in my field of study, is the researcher's own wishfulness, really is what I would have to refer to it as. The idea that you see resemblances and imagine that a certain group of things must represent a particular thing, and you start chasing that. They call it chasing unicorns sometimes.
Or cherry picking.
Right.
Yeah.
So the way to prevent that is to make the requirement that the interpretation begins with the cultures that are being studied. That the Dogon flatly say this symbol represents a certain thing. I can now test that against how the other cultures saw the same element. And if you can see agreement in 3 or 4 different cultures about the meaning of a symbol, you pretty well have a lock on an original meaning for the symbol.
So let's go back to Skara Brae, this wonderful little community. Looking at the pictures, I can just imagine like a hobbit community living there or something. It reminds me of the abode that you see in Hollywood films,
right?
With these wonderful rounded, almost rounded mounds. It looks like mound architecture almost. Did they also have ancient mounds there that we would think of, that we find in Ohio?
Yeah, they have burial cairns. On Orkney there are about 400 sites of interest, ancient sites of interest that span a range of eras from the Neolithic. Some are Viking sites, some are Pictish sites. This is over a period of a few thousand years. And the sites are all very available on Orkney still. Most of them are not restricted or a person can walk into the site and explore it themselves and have freedom of movement around. There are only a few where they're going to charge you to try to see something.
Wow.
A little bit remotely located, and the weather can be harsh. The best time to go is during July or August.
Now, you also discovered, looking at the housing structures, that there is some overlap with what you found in Egypt.
Well, one of the differences between Orkney and a place like Egypt, in Egypt you have endless evidence you can look at, artwork and papyrus texts and Egyptian hieroglyphic carved words in temples and carved images of deities and just pottery vases and so forth. On Orkney, there's a very small amount of evidence. It's very, very slim. A few artifacts. You have architecture, you have ancient names of places, very limited set. You have a relative handful of excavated skeletons and things like that, burial sites. So you're working from a very slim set of evidence. My entry point into the study ended up being the plan of the stone houses at Skara Brae. It turns out that over a period of 600 years, all but one structure was rebuilt. But they know what the original structures looked like, and they were all built to the same plan. It's a very interesting plan. It's a unique plan, according to the researchers there. It's a little chambered house with a round room at one end. They're not sure what it was. A central room that's square, 2 side rooms that are rectangular, and a rectangular entryway at the bottom.
But even like some of the side rooms, they're just barely large enough for like a body to lay down and sleep in. So they're
Right.
really kind of like sleeping chambers, probably almost, right?
That's right. Now, in doing comparisons to the Dogon, to imagine, could there be a commonality, or could we be seeing an influence like the questioner suggested? The Dogon live in a desert country, and they build mostly from mud. But occasionally they do build a stone house, and when they build it the same way the Skara Brae houses, according to the same plan as the Skara Brae houses. But for the Dogon, there's a purpose to that. The plan has symbolism associated with it. The plan represents the body of a sleeping goddess, and the round room is her head, the side rooms are her arms, the central room is her body cavity, and the entryway are her sexual parts. And so now, seeing the commonality of plan, that opens the door to analyzing or discussing the Skara Brae elements in terms of the Dogon cosmology and in terms of Dogon language. And when we do that, all sorts of things pop up in terms of, oh yes, this is the same representation as this. There are place names on Orkney that they only have tentative etymology for. They trace them back. They have an idea that this place name was named what it was for a reason that an etymologist guessed. They don't have no written text to go by. But when you examine those place names in terms of Dogon and Egyptian words, you see that the meaning of the Dogon and Egyptian words describes the site that the thing's located at. It was named in this place because of the meaning of the word. So that kind of comparative work also serves to pull things together in terms of we're looking at a common system. The misunderstanding I had was I was coming at it from a perspective thinking that I was seeing Egyptian influences on Scotland, even though that made no sense to me in terms of timing. There's a difference in the two house plans between the Skara Brae house and the Dogon house. The Skara Brae house includes a central hearth, square hearth in the center of the central room, right where you would place the heart in a body. The Dogon house is in a subtropical climate where they don't need a hearth in the house, so there was no hearth there. I was imagining that the Dogon house was original and someone had added the hearth on Skara Brae and added it in keeping with the symbolism of the plan. Later I came to realize that I was looking at things backwards, that the Skara Brae plan was original and the Dogon had simply removed the hearth because they didn't need it.
Because in the desert it's warm and you don't need to, you can cook outside, you don't necessarily need to cook inside.
Right. And so there's a reasonable perspective from which we're seeing pre-dynastic time influences on Egypt about 100 or 200 years before the appearance of a dynastic Egypt in Scotland. Same thing with the other sites in China and Ireland and in South America. It looks like they're all the product of the same set of influences, which would go a long way toward explaining, Jung's archetypes. Why do they appear everywhere? It's because they all were influenced by the same instruction.
It's absolutely fascinating. I could see some of the building reflections in sites I've been to in Peru as well. And I even mentioned this to you last night. Looking at some of the ancient stone cairns we can even find around in this country, certainly in places like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut. There even is this place, I think in southern New Hampshire, called America's Stonehenge, where it's literally not quite like a Stonehenge in England that we think of, but very similar, standing stones, marking procession, marking sun movements and things like that.
Right.
And could be used for agriculture, could be used for timekeeping. And there are stone living cairns or quarters, very similar. Central room, side rooms for possible sleeping, entrances, entrances that kind of curve around almost for protection with large stones over top. It looked very similar.
Yeah, it's very similar. I agree.
It's leads one to think that these potential ancient mariners made it even to this country and had civilization here. Maybe we're part of the original mound builders or original cultures that were here.
Right. And there are other commonalities that go along with well, first of all, the kinds of stone circles you're talking about are definitely connected to agriculture. This is a tool that can be used to predict when to plant the seeds and when to harvest the crops and so forth. But with a center gnomon or stick in the center of the circle, you have a time-keeping device, a sundial basically, to keep time during the day. And the stones of the circle cast shadows that can be used to track seasons and equinoxes and solstices. It's a scientific tool, it's a calendar, it's a clock.
Yes, it's just absolutely fascinating. There is evidence at America's Stonehenge that there was a central standing stone that tracked, you were able to easily track that. Even in Machu Picchu, right on the plateau, there was a central stone. I've read in a book from the 50s, they removed it in like maybe 55 or something to land a helicopter there at a ceremony.
Yeah.
And they could never upright it again in the center of a plateau.
Yes.
And they just discarded it, and you think, oh my goodness, this major artifact, and we've lost records of it.
That's part of the problem. A big problem with a lot of the ancient sites is any of them that have gone through any kind of extensive rebuilding, you may have lost the trail to what the original symbolism was. And we have some major effects at about 700 BC that changed the way, it looked like it changes the way certain alignments were. And a lot of these structures were substantially rebuilt after 709 BC. So it's hard to know, is what we're looking at an original form or is it a rebuilt form? And it makes a difference.
Yes, and there actually is a series of standing stones in the Orkney Islands that looks very much like some other standing stone structures from Egypt.
Right.
Playa, is it called Playa de...
Nabta Playa.
Nabta Playa, thank you. Yes, they look almost identical.
Right,
Yes.
very similar.
Yes. So if people are interested in learning more about your work, tell us, do you keep a website, and if you might want to name some of the books that you've written? And
The easiest way to find the books is you can go to my publisher's website, innertraditions.com, and there's a page for Laird Scranton with all my books listed, or there's also a page at simonandschuster.com. Amazon also has a page. If they want to find me personally, there is a LairdScranton.com website, but it's a fan site that has not been maintained very well. And so it's been easier to find me on Facebook probably. I'm the only Laird Scranton on Facebook. So message me. It's better if you friend me first and then message me. I often don't see the messages if they haven't friended me first.
And are you speaking at any upcoming conferences?
I do fairly frequent podcasts and radio shows, sometimes national radio shows, and I get around to conferences several a year usually. At the moment I don't have a lot scheduled in the immediate future. Mostly it's going to be articles and podcasts in the short term.
People can also find interviews with you, not only here at Radnor Studio 21. We did an interview about 3 years ago, so it's in our archives, and at Mainline Mufon. There's a video link to an interview we did before. But I believe you've also been on Coast to Coast. And
yes, there are many on YouTube. You'll find lots of references. The day my wife Risa and I met John Anthony West, he surprised us and filmed the meeting. And that became episode 8 of the Magical Egypt series. A couple of hours of discussion with John about my book. First time I'd ever spoken with him. Only blindsided me a little bit. But there are lots of little things like that out there on the internet that can be found.
Well, it's such a pleasure to chat and discuss with you, and it's such a pleasure to hear you lecture. I look forward to having you back for Mainline MUFON. If you'd like to follow some of our programs, you can easily find us at mainlinemufon.com. You can look at programs there, upcoming programs. There's even a video page at the website, and you can look at other interviews we've done with Laird and other guests. And you can contact me and sign up for an email list. And we also have conferences that occur in the general area, and there's conference pages there with information. So I hope if you're curious on topics of ancient archaeology, astronomy, the UFO topic, or just the paranormal phenomenon, we cover a lot of these topics. We like to think outside the box, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.